Hello, America. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Rosen Center and PFAS conference attendees and everyone in America watching us online. I want to welcome everyone here and again everyone online to the opening pre-conference workshop for PFAS Forum 3. My name is Michael Goldstein. I have the privilege and the honor to moderate this session and to provide a few opening remarks. I'm joined by a very stellar faculty, Edwin Baez, who is an environmental underwriter with Beazley Insurance, and my colleague, Kelly Kite, who is the co-managing partner and co-CEO of Goldstein Kite Environmental, which is an environmental redevelopment company. We are gathered here today to kick off the conference. This is, again, a pre-conference workshop to have a discussion about what I characterized to one of my colleagues, Robin Neely, as an existential issue within this arena. Can these sites, PFAS-impacted sites, and we're going to be discussing PFAS in extreme technical detail over the next several days, but we want to try and set the stage from a redevelopment perspective, from a transactional perspective. We're going to go deep into all of the complexities associated with assessing and remediating and working through emerging government regulations around this family of chemicals. But in the interim, what do we do with these properties? Can they be sold? Can they be financed? How should they be operated? What are some of the construction and reuse issues? So this initial workshop and then the final session of the conference, or one of the final sessions of the conference, which is a legal session, are really good bookends to the dense, important, complicated technical issues that we'll be exploring over the first, over the duration of the conference. We're calling this workshop PFAS Shark Tank: Strategies for Marketing, Insuring, Transacting, Financing, Redeveloping, and Reusing PFAS Impacted Sites. I'm going to set the stage as soon as they bring up my initial presentation by going into some of the developments that we're seeing at the federal level in the U.S. Congress, with U.S. EPA, and then here at the state level through the Florida Brownfields program, to talk about some of the options that exist and tools that Congress and EPA may be giving us to move these sites forward from stasis to sale to acquisition to financing to redevelopment and reuse. And I'm, again, going to discuss some of the emerging developments at the federal level, legislatively, administratively, fall back, talk a little bit about some of the resources and tools that exist currently at the state level, and then we're going to move forward rapidly. Edwin is going to talk about the state of environmental insurance. Is the insurance industry right now providing coverage for PFAS impacted sites? Are they only providing coverage for certain sites? What is the universe of data that an insured will need to provide to someone like Edwin in order to be able to get coverage, if at all? There is some anecdotal information floating around, some folklore, if you will, newly minted folklore that these sites can't be covered at all. I don't think that's what some of us are seeing, but it's important to get this message out into the industry, especially among the consultants and engineers who are really in the trenches with the clients, with the owners and developers who are struggling to make business sense of what they are now forced to deal with. So much uncertainty, technical uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, and all of that ties into the transactional and redevelopment uncertainty. Edwin and his colleagues in the underwriting community are really doing the heavy lifting of making these sites transactable, we think, but we'll hear from Edwin. And then after Edwin speaks, my colleague, Kelly Kite, who is actually actively seeking out PFAS-impacted sites for acquisition and as a principal going through the cost-benefit analysis and dealing with the lenders and trying to place capital, whether it's equity or debt. He's going to share with the group some of his thought process and the sites that his group would be willing to entertain and on what basis. And then at that point, what we're going to do is we are going to open up the presentation and make it less of us talking to you. We want you to talk to us and to talk to the others in the audience. We want this presentation to turn into a healthy dialogue. And there may be questions for some of the practitioners here. There may be suggestions, other points of information that all of the experts here in the room want to share for the good of the order. Okay, so we're going to get started right now. Let's talk about what's happening at the federal level. There is a general consensus in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate that something needs to be done beyond setting really exacting standards, MCLs and the like, that there needs to be some safe harbors for certain sectors so that the extraordinary cost of assessment and remediation aren't unfairly allocated and allocated to some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of how these contaminants have been generated. Right now, Senator Loomis from, that should be Kentucky, has proposed 5 bills. She introduced those on May 3rd, 2023, aimed at providing protections to several sectors from Superfund liability related to PFAS contamination. These bills are obviously in response to the proposed federal rule to lower the MCL to 4 parts per trillion under CERCLA. The aim is to provide very narrow liability relief to 5 certain sectors that are arguably passive downstream receivers of PFAS pollution. This is a very good place to start. We don't want it to end there, but it's certainly a good place to start and start this dialogue that we're going to have. Municipal landfills, drinking water and wastewater treatment facilities and farms. Those are the downstream receivers. And then there are certain categories of users or operators who have been forced as a matter of policy to use PFAS and firefighting foams, airports, refineries, and fuel terminals. Again, 5 bills. There's a resource management bill that shields certain solid waste management facilities from liability, but the liability protection will only apply if the release of PFAS from a protected entity resulted from the disposal or management of any residuals or byproduct of municipal solid waste in accordance with a permit. And there's a laundry list of permits that are tied into this bill, but by and large, these are RCRA permitted solid waste management facilities that are the recipient of the first safe harbor under the Loomis legislation. The second bill is the water systems bill, and here protected entities are public water systems as defined under the Safe Drinking Water Act, publicly or privately owned or operated treatment works, also as defined in the Clean Water Act, and several other types of water facility and processing users, both public and private. Here, the protection would only apply if a protected entity transports, treats, disposes of, or arranges for the treatment, transport, or disposal of covered PFAS in a manner that is consistent with all applicable laws at the time the activity is carried out. So this is similar to the requirement under the Resource Management Bill that the activities leading to the release were consistent with the underlying permit. There's an agriculture bill which shields parties from costs or damages provided that they're engaged in the production or harvesting of agricultural products under the Agricultural Marketing Act. And then there is an airport's liability bill, which does what you would expect it to do, provide protection to a sponsor, including a sponsor of the civilian portion of a joint use airport or a shared use airport. The protections would only apply if the release of a covered PFAS by a sponsor resulted from the use of AFFF that was required by the FAA in compliance with the applicable regulation. And then finally, there's a fire suppression bill that would apply to entities with fire suppression systems installed or otherwise in use with applicable fire codes. As you can see from the last bullet item on this slide, the legislation has tremendous backing from some very significant professional organizations and lobbying groups all over the United States. I'm not going to list them, but they're there on the screen. And of course, all of these materials will be available after the conference. Now, having said that, even though there's a lot of industry support, it's not clear that this particular legislation will pass. It's sponsored by most of the Republicans on the Senate Environmental Public Works Committee, but interestingly, it's not necessarily supported by the ranking member, Shelley Capito, from West Virginia. She apparently has not joined in an affirmation of support yet. Her position is negotiations are delicate, and she is waiting to see how things play out. In addition, there is significant pushback from the Enviros. The Environmental Working Group, which is a national and very well-resourced and well-regarded environmental advocacy organization, has taken a contrary position. They feel that these bills are unnecessary. They're a distraction from the work of Congress to protect public drinking water systems from PFAS. And her position is, and her group's position is, that there are already multiple layers of defense and liability exemptions available under CERCLA. So that's at the legislative level, the congressional level. EPA understands all of the agita that's been expressed by industry and by others, and so what they have done is they have engaged in some administrative initiatives to reaffirm and expand the enforcement discretion that they have been authorized under Congress pursuant to CERCLA. EPA has held 2 listening sessions where they have identified a series of industry sectors that they believe should be protected against EPA enforcement. And these are some of the same sectors covered by the lumens legislation: landfills, publicly owned drinking works, facilities that generate and use biosolids, and of course the AFFF users, including airports and fire response entities. The feedback that EPA is getting from industry is that this is a good start, but it's not enough, that an exercise of administrative discretion will not protect private users from cost recovery claims or contribution claims. Of course, that's existential for those who want to sell or buy PFAS-impacted sites for redevelopment, which of course implicates environmental insurance, and Edwin's going to talk about how his industry can fill the gap. And then Kelly's going to talk about whether any of this makes sense to him and or is meaningful. Is Do we need legislation before the private sector is ready to move forward, before his group is ready to move forward? Or is he willing to rely on, he and his colleagues, are they willing to rely on environmental insurance and some of the existing resources and tools that can be used today? And that takes me to my last slide and really the way in which I wanted to frame this conversation. What resources exist today here in Florida? The Florida Brownfields Program is and has been since 1997 a very powerful tool for limiting risk and subsidizing cost and putting bookends around a regulatory process that may otherwise seem to be endless. I've put on the slide here what I think are the key elements to help everyone understand the context of how the Brownfields Program may be sufficient currently combined with environmental insurance to make PFAS impacted sites transactable even today. And that's really, if you haven't gathered it yet, that's the thesis of this pre-conference workshop, that notwithstanding all of the hand-wringing and the concern that we're all going through and have been over the last several years as we try and understand what this emergent contaminant means, and we deal with these very low MCLs and limitations in how to properly assess for this contamination in the field. We believe, these panelists believe, and we can't wait to hear what the audience thinks, that PFAS impacted sites are still transactable. They can continue to move in the stream of commerce provided that you wrap them in the right liability management structure. And then the cherry on top of the cake, of course, is the technical approach that you would take to address any on-site impacts or off-site impacts, and we'll talk about that over the next 2 days. But the Florida Brownfields Program already provides, we suggest, the liability management and the economic subsidies that one would want to, provided that you have good consulting, and we're all great consultants in this room, to understand a client's risk and get comfortable with the risk and move forward with disposition, acquisition, financing, reuse, redevelopment, and the commercial financing needed to fund the redevelopment and reuse. The first two statutory references I have on the screen go to the definition of brownfield site and brownfield area. And I picked those because what you will see is that there's nothing specific in the definition of a brownfield area or a brownfield site that ties to a particular contaminant. And so if one is concerned about whether a PFAS impacted site, whether it's got minor impacts or very, very significant impacts in the thousands or tens of thousands parts per trillion, there is no automatic exclusion under the Brownfields Program. The Brownfields Program is agnostic with respect to contaminant types. So that's the first takeaway that we really want to emphasize. And then the second takeaway is the scope of the liability protection, which I know has gotten our good friend and colleague Edwin Baez very comfortable on a number of difficult sites, because the liability protection under the Florida Brownfields Program, and it's threefold. It protects against liability for remediation, which would essentially bar an action in injunctive relief to compel a property owner or a developer or a responsible party to do more cleanup than one would agree to undertake with FDEP or a local pollution control program like Hillsborough County EPC. So the integrity of whatever cleanup you've negotiated with the state will be maintained, notwithstanding the fact that your neighbor may want you to do something more. So that's number one. Number two is liability and contribution to any other party who has or may incur cleanup liability for the contaminated site or sites. What that means is, if I buy a PFAS impacted site and my good friend Kelly owns a development site right next door and sues me because he hires the best environmental lawyer in the land, Robin Neely, to come after me for cost recovery, I'm going to hold up my brownfield site rehabilitation agreement and say, Robin and Kelly, you're barred from going into court. It's a very powerful tool, which again makes someone like Edwin more comfortable because it's a rolling head start on underwriting the insurance company's risk. And then finally, under the Florida Brownfields program, there's protection against claims for property damages and other forms of economic damage. And that's one of the greatest risks associated with PFAS contamination because it's so mobile and tends to go deep and then run off-site and impact third-party properties. So that's where I want to close. Again, the thesis here is that notwithstanding the major technical brain damage and massive risk posed by the still uncertain nature of the contamination and where the roulette wheel of federal MCL will land and how that plays into what Florida does from a legislative level. At the federal level, there's liability relief coming. We think it's going to ultimately be broader than is currently proposed for the 5 sectors. And what I forgot to mention in one of the slides is that at a public comment, one of the 2 public comment sessions, I suggested to EPA that they consider expanding the safe harbor to include any party that has entered into a brownfields agreement with a state agency or a local pollution control agency. That's a way to, again, further leverage the power of a state brownfields program like the Florida Brownfields program and make it easier for someone like Edwin to write a policy that provides $10 or $20 million or more in coverage. But let's hear from Edwin himself as to how the insurance market is responding to this risk and can supplement what we're beginning to see at the federal level and what already exists in the state level, so that you have a message that you can take back to your clients, right? On the one hand, there's no easy answer on the technical issues, but what they really want to know is, am I stuck with this property? Can I sell it? What are the arguments that I need to make to a buyer, to a lender?
So, see if this works. Great. My name is Edwin Baez. I've been with Beazley Environmental for 6 years. I've been underwriting environmental insurance for the last 23 years. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Beazley Insurance, Beazley Environmental, our product, and how we've been handling PFAS. First, a little bit about my company, my organization, Beazley Insurance. We're a specialty insurer, so we don't do construction, we don't do metal market. We basically do the insurance that other people may be intimidated to do. So cyber, product recall, environmental, that's kind of our specialty. We're publicly traded on the London Stock Exchange. BEZ is our symbol. Last year, we had a gross written premium of $5 billion, and we're an A-rated carrier. And the background is a little bit important because a lot of what we do is multi-year deals. So we can write up to a 10-year policy. So you want to do that with a company that has the financial backing to kind of support that. About Beazley Environmental, we're a little bit different. There's 20 underwriters across the US, London, and Canada. All of us have over 20 years of underwriting experience, so kind of the model is let the experienced people do what they do and hopefully bring some good opportunities to the organization. And basically, fixed site is all we do. So there's a lot of competitors who dabble in this space as far as fixed site pollution. They really do environmental casualty and not really fixed site pollution, and that's what we do, and we do it all day. And kind of the exciting part about my job is 1 minute I'm working on a real estate portfolio, next minute I'm working on a brownfield site. So it's a broad spectrum of opportunity and challenges that makes the work great. And we're one of the few carriers that can put up $25 million in a 10-year term. We've actually had a lot of our competitors exit this space. AIG and Zurich kind of being the 2 biggest ones recently, really because of things in the past and not underwriting going forward. But really when you talk about fixed site pollution, I would say there's 3 or 4 carriers that can kind of compete at this level. What does the typical base policy cover? Bodily injury, property damage, and cleanup costs. Cleanup costs being kind of the major one. When you find something you weren't expecting, we clean it up. Other component that I'll talk about in more detail later on is legal defense. So if you have a third-party claim, who are you calling to handle that type of situation? Who has the experience to handle that type of situation? You know, we have a team of claims people that's kind of what they do all day. And also kind of the policy, in addition to that, kind of like those base coverages, we handle disposal site coverage, transportation coverage, business interruption when you have that pollution loss, and natural resource damage. It's kind of the idea of the policy when it was originally constructed was to kind of cradle to grave EPA mindset of being responsible for the product throughout. Definition of pollution condition, I'll get into more detail in my next slide, but it's pretty broad. It's hazardous and non-hazardous materials. We've covered things like odor, milk spills. So that's kind of the idea. The idea is to cover on the active portfolio side, stuff that's not traditionally covered by your GL and pollution, and from the redevelopment side, stuff that you weren't really expecting to see. And in addition to that, we do, once I guess the redevelopment deals or placements are difficult because, well, you'll find out early on whether you missed or not, right? During that construction phase, they'll find something they weren't expecting and you'll have a claim. But you'll be surprised, especially with a 10-year deal, how mold, Legionella, asbestos, lead, not those as much, but bacteria may eventually impact the building, and you'll have coverage through that policy as well. So that's why some of our competitors don't want to put out a longer-term deal, or longer-term placement policy. What is the role of environmental insurance? So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to read out it's pretty long, but I'm going to read out the definition of a pollution condition. Any solid, liquid, gaseous, or thermal irritant, contaminant, or pollutant, including but not limited to smoke, vapor, soot, fumes, acid, alkalis, chemicals, toxic or hazardous substances, waste materials, including medical, infectious, and pathological waste, low-level radioactive waste, material into or upon land or structures, thereupon the atmosphere, any watercourse, body of water, or groundwater, which results in bodily injury, property damage, or cleanup costs, which this insurance applies. Pollution condition includes the presence of Legionella and microbial matter at or within any structure of the covered location. Pollution condition does not include any exposure to infected humans or animals or contact with bodily fluids or infected humans or animals. So the idea is to be broad and cover those situations that we weren't expecting. The other big component of our policies that, as I mentioned earlier, if people don't think about, is the legal defense costs. Like if you do have a pollution condition that impacts a third party, who are you going to call? Who has those resources? Who knows how to deal with those scenarios? Your traditional lawyer won't know the ramifications and won't know the logistics of handling such a claim. And you know, when you buy a policy, environmental insurance policy, they have people that do that regularly. That's what they do, including even crisis and reputation management expenses in that. So, who buys pollution insurance? Mergers and acquisitions, private equity, real estate investment trusts, property developers, property owners, manufacturers, I mean, the full gamut. Anything from an active portfolio owner to someone who's developing the property. My friend PFAS has made my life pretty interesting the last couple of years, and mostly because of the numerous manufacturers that potentially use this product or involved in this product. And you know, usually you'll have, you know, a gas station, you'll have petroleum contamination, a dry cleaner, you'll have chlorinated solvents. You can't put PFAS in a box. It just keeps getting out. Every time you think you have it, an idea of where it is, you'll be surprised. And that's one of the challenges. When an opportunity hits my desk, the first thing I'm thinking is PFAS exposure. Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? High, you know, like someone who like a chrome plating operation, you know, you want to see more data with regards to do they have PFAS or not, and based on your knowledge. Moderate, again, you're kind of thinking, how can I craft this to add value to the client, but still protect the organization? And low does not mean zero. Low means low probability, but you'll be surprised by a neighboring site. They may have used PFAS and has contaminated your site. Or you'll be surprised, you'll think of a location that has a clean history, but they didn't tell you about, or you didn't know about the fire they had a couple years ago, and they used firefighting foam to put it out. So it's a challenge. As like I said, every submission that comes to my desk these days, the first thing I'm thinking about is PFAS and my exposure, and how can I protect the organization but still add value to the client. We didn't know it existed. That's one of the other major challenges of PFAS. So we have policies out there, 5, 10-year policies, and we had a general idea of PFAS a few years ago, but we didn't expect it to get to this level of concern. So we have policies out there that are sitting out there potentially that may involve PFAS. No lower changing standards. In the States, nobody wants to be the first one to act, right? Everyone's waiting on someone else to act. And so that's also a component of what we do. Not only with whether or not it's there during the redevelopment stage, but also reopener coverage, right? So you got the NFA, you think you're set, and then a couple of years later, potentially someone may knock on your door and say, hey, you have PFAS here, and you need to open up this site again. So that's also a component of our business that we insure. So now whether or not it'll be there, and also the potential reopener coverage. State programs are requiring testing. Like New York City Brownfield requires testing for PFAS. ISRA, to close out a site in New Jersey, requires testing for PFAS. Connecticut Transfer Act, when they're requiring testing for PFAS. And so those are things that we need to think about, and what value can we add. And the other challenge that I have is that, outside of a PFAS exclusion, nothing stops the government from there's no protection of the policy. If the government shows up and knocks on your door, the policy is triggered. There's nothing really I can do to mitigate that risk. And I'm talking more along the lines of active locations, so that, for example, manufacturing location, we may be able to put some limitations, say, hey, don't voluntarily investigate, don't develop it. But if the government comes knocking on your door, there's nothing in our policy that would protect us from triggering and having to pay, having to investigate and remediate. Some of the positives with PFAS is that, we've been underwriting for 3 or 4 years now, and the losses have been good overall. We haven't seen what we expected to see just yet. And we're, as time goes, those policies are expiring, and we're on kind of the equal footing with what's out there. It's everywhere. So one of the things is that one of the concerns we have is third-party bodily injury. And so I hear there's a stat, I don't know how true it is, but they say 95% of the people have PFAS in their bloodstream already. And so good luck trying to find the source of that, and who's the source of your PFAS, and good luck trying to find that person and litigating against them. It doesn't appear to be an indoor air concern, so it's not like chlorinated solvents where you have a plume that can impact indoor air at third-party sites. That's a positive for us. That's kind of where we see some claims activity, not from PFAS, but from chlorinated solvents and other contaminants. Remediation technology is getting better. Early on it was a struggle, and now we're seeing, I think you guys are doing a great job of coming forward with that technology to remediate these sites. And from having conversations with friends in the industry, institutional or engineering controls, they're saying, hey, Edwin, the site's already in an industrial area. We have this plume. It's not impacting anyone. It's not impacting a water source. It's not really impacting any significant third parties. I don't see the government requiring us to go in and remediate just for PFAS. There's other contaminants that we have to worry about in that plume. Some of the claims activity that we've seen, in general, I've seen in the industry. One is a automotive part manufacturer, and the first 3 are actually operational. The 4th one is really a redevelopment type risk, but the 3rd ones are more kind of active facilities. The first one, automotive part manufacturing, is basically a chrome plater that was Michigan is very, because of Flint, is one of the tougher EPA states nowadays, and they were doing some investigations on PFAS in waterways, and they found an automotive part manufacturer that was plating, and they, we had to pay $800,000 in cleanup costs associated with that. Landfill PRP, which is another area that we didn't see at first coming out, but became a concern later on, where manufacturers would take contaminated materials to a landfill. This landfill became insolvent, and it was there's a groundwater plume going to the landfill into a residential community, And PFAS, even though PFAS is obviously not the only contaminant, it's the hot topic nowadays. So that was kind of the forefront of the litigation. Carpet recycler in Georgia, and this is another thing you'll see is that kind of a cluster. I'll give you an example of this Georgia one, where it's basically a cluster of rug manufacturers. And this entity wasn't a recycler. He wasn't really a manufacturer of it. But because he was in the territory and his product may contain PFAS, he was kind of brought into the litigation of it. And so we're having to spend money defending this recycler, even though technically he's very low on the totem pole as opposed to a manufacturer. And that's why I say that legal defense is a valuable aspect of the policy. And then the redevelopment risk is an interesting one. So this is New Jersey. It's a former chemical manufacturing site. They were just about to get their RAO, and the LSRP said, test for PFAS. And so that opened up the can of worms again. And the best part was that, we went to them and said, hey, it's an industrial area, it's a commercial warehouse, to what level? And they said, all of it. And we were like, that can't be right. To what level? They said, all of it. So we had to pay $6 million on that redevelopment risk. So that's pretty much it. Questions?
We're going. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So we're generally going to wait until the end of Kelly's presentation to accept questions. Except I have one question for you,
Sure.
and that is just so the right message goes out into the community. From what I heard you say, Beazley is still writing policies on PFAS impacted sites. Is that correct?
Correct. Every day.
And would you write a policy, I think I know the answer to this, would you write a policy on a PFAS impacted site to cover bodily injury and property damage, provided that a claim has not yet been made at the time the application was submitted to you for coverage?
Absolutely. If we can get comfortable with potential plume and where it's going, where it's going to be impacted, we do that every day. And there's different ways for us to kind of skin the cat. Depending on the data that's available, where we are, we can use sublimits, we can use higher deductibles. But the idea is to add value and provide value to the client. That's why we're here.
Fabulous. Okay, so that's another piece that has fallen into place, and Kelly's going to get up and talk about how these pieces actually get used by at least one developer. Edwin, thank you. We're going to come back to you after Kelly finishes. So the first few pieces in our thesis, which is it's not all, we're not rending our garments, right? We're not sitting in ashes. There are strategies that can be employed to move these sites forward. We heard about environmental insurance. There's legislation that may be coming down the road from U.S. EPA. From the U.S. Congress. EPA has already initiated an undertaking to provide administrative discretion to a broad group of users whom we hope will become even more broad. And then, again, at least in Florida, and I know this forum isn't related to Florida, but there's a heavy emphasis on Florida, tools currently exist in the Florida Brownfields program to get developers and lenders comfortable with PFAS risk. So the sites can be sold, they can be bought, they can be purchased, they can be redeveloped, and they can be reused, at least in theory. This is the man with the money who's trying to do it, so let's hear from him next.
Okay, so redevelopment of PFAS impacted sites. You get yourself a good insurance policy from Edwin and you just let it rip. No, all kidding aside. So first of all, if we're redeveloping a site that was impacted with PFAS, we're going to look at, is this a good piece of real estate? So we need to look at what the highest and best use is of that piece of real estate. Because depending on the PFAS impacts, you may not be able to redevelop to the highest and best use for that particular piece of real estate. So what's the next highest best use, and does that make sense? From a risk management standpoint, you have, of course, your brownfields program in the particular state you're in, which Michael just mentioned. You have insurance from Edwin, and you have the ability to hire the right consultants that can get you comfortable with the risk you're taking, and also protect you from future risks. So as a developer, we need to look at the financial viability of the likely remediation required. So before you even get into your phase 1, phase 2 geotechnical analysis, you got to consider if this site is likely impacted by PFAS. Is it next to a landfill? Is it a landfill? Is it next to a fire station? Was there a manufacturing facility on the site or nearby the site that manufactured products that had PFAS in them? That way, you have a good idea what potential sources are nearby, what historical uses the property may have had in the past, before we even get to the point of looking at undertaking a lot of money in underwriting. When we've gone through all the typical underwriting and we know what we're dealing with, that's when we have to really look at the financial viability of both the remediation and the credits and incentives available through the various programs to cover some of those costs. We can create engineering barriers. We can remove PFAS. There's technology in place to stabilize PFAS, and it's yet to be proven if we can actually destroy it financially viably. Particularly in Florida, we have a lot of incentives, both by the means of tax credits, grants, loans from regional planning councils that can cover a lot of these costs or reimburse a lot of these costs that are spent along the way. So maybe on their face, when you put a pencil to paper, they don't make sense, but when you take that into account all the various benefits and financial incentives from the different programs, then they can make a lot more sense. We are a company that's willing to take on these PFAS sites, both by acquisition and acquiring PFAS impacted sites, whether the site itself was a source or whether adjacent properties were the source. We're also willing to finance properties that are impacted by PFAS. And we're willing to do that, taking these other things into account. Doing the right due diligence, hiring the right consultants, looking at the protections from both insurance, from the brownfields program, and getting comfortable with the lay of the land as it exists and as the guidelines and policies are moving forward. You'll find that most traditional lenders, if there is PFAS impacts to any degree and they are aware of them, are not going to finance these type of sites. But using the right precautions, we're comfortable doing that. Do we need regulation? Of course we need regulation. There's not a lot of folks out there that are going to be comfortable moving forward on these sites if there's not. Obviously everyone wants to see, PFAS, PFOA contained, destroyed, removed. But if it's not financially viable to do so, that doesn't benefit anyone. Then these sites will just sit there in plain sight, forever and continue to impact people, property, and so forth. So no different than, vapor intrusion used to be a big deal, 30, 40 years ago, and the whole industry was freaking out, how we're going to handle this, both as existing buildings, new constructions. They came up with methods and procedures that were able to address it in existing properties and then also in new construction, that took care of those elements, whether it be, sealing areas from vapor intrusion, creating, exhaust systems. And we think with PFAS and PFOA, that is what's going to happen because as Edwin said, or Michael, that 95% of people likely have some form of PFAS or PFOA in their bodies. So we're all exposed to it. We all come into contact with it. And of course, some more than others, depending on the source that you've spent time around. But there's only way to move forward if it's financially viable, because the problem's not going to fix itself. So from a real estate perspective, we think it's doable. Myself, and there may be some other organizations out there that are willing to take the financial risk going forward. And that's about it.
Kelly, thank you. I'm going to invoke the moderator's privilege and ask you a question before we open it up to the group. And that's this. The risk, as you've explained it, is outsized. And there are a lot of factors that go into your analysis of whether to move forward on a particular asset, are you seeing a discount in the marketplace in terms of sale price that's commensurate with the risk? That is, are these assets, these PFAS impacted properties, being discounted at a greater rate than other impacted properties?
More recently, yes, as people incorporate PFAS into, their phase 1 and phase 2 testing, which of course that wasn't done until the last few years. And, interested buyers are finding that. And the seller also has to be educated on the fact that, the issues that exist with PFAS now were educated by their environmental consultants on, what the potential impacts could be for them, and what the potential impacts could be for the buyer going forward. So when it comes to, buyers of sites, I recommend that any sellers look to buyers that are experienced. They understand what they're getting into. They understand the risk. They understand how to protect the seller subsequently through adding to an insurance policy, taking on the liability, an environmental liability risk transfer. But we are seeing that this has become more prevalent. I think it will continue to do so. Right now, we are purchasing a site that is close to or adjacent to a bellwether case in the federal court for PFAS impacted sites based on firefighting foam that was used there. We're pursuing that. I think we're highly likely to close on that this year. But again, it's one of the bellwether cases in the United States right next door that's impacted by this. So that site we're actually buying for the bargain price of $100. So if you want to talk about discounted, because the seller is aware of the potential risks that the PFAS contamination causes, they're aware of the magnitude. In this particular case, the groundwater was severely affected to the extent that the actual town had to change the source of their groundwater. So massive damages by having to change the source of the groundwater for the entire community. So yeah, discounts, we're seeing them happen, and we're seeing them happen more and more.
Kelly, thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're moving into the second phase of this workshop. And I'm going to pull a nifty trick here and hopefully change everyone's perspective just a little bit. This deck was stacked, right? Because I had a thesis that I wanted to put out into the industry, into this audience, and that is we don't need to sit on the sidelines with these sites. They can be transacted, they can be moved, they can be sold, they can be bought, they can be financed, they can be redeveloped, and they can be reused. But this is the amen choir up here. We've got an active developer who has a site under contract. We have an insurance company that's writing policies. We have an environmental lawyer who's advising buyers and sellers and lenders. And we've got some environmental lawyers in the audience who are doing this, including, I failed to mention, Frank Hearn, the Dean of the Florida Environmental Bar. We're graced by your presence, Mr. Hearn, and Frank will be moderating a bookend session to this one at the very end of the conference, where we go down a rabbit hole on a lot of legal issues, and it will be a nice way to round out all of the technical presentations that will ensue after this pre-conference workshop. But here's the shift in perspective. We're calling this PFAS Shark Tank, right? But it's really us here pitching you. You guys are the Shark Tank. We're not the Shark Tank. We have a thesis, again, a story that we're telling, and we want you to buy that story. So you're the skeptical audience, right? You're the skeptical hosts, actually. And now what I want to do is, Gene, I think you have the microphone, correct? I want to hear from those anyone in the audience who has a perspective with respect to what we've said, the positions we've taken. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have questions for one of us? Or do you have a case study or an individual perspective that you would like to offer to the group and solicit input from some of your colleagues here on the technical side, on the legal side, on the regulatory side? We've got a phenomenal regulator here, Allison Amram with Hillsborough County EPC, who has a tremendous amount of experience representing the the regulatory side of what we're all trying to accomplish. Gene, are you going to be walking around with the microphone?
Absolutely.
Okay, who would like to go first? Anyone? Allison.
Of course, you would be the first one up front.
Wonderful.
Allison.
Thank you. I just want to mention, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. That in the brownfield program, your property has to be the source property for the PFAS. So if you are an adjacent property that's receiving like down gradient impacts, that the source property would have to be part of that brownfield site as well, as best as I can tell.
Very good. That's good perspective. Thank you. Paco?
Next, I got a question. What happens with a seller? Like if I as a buyer do a phase 1, phase 2, I find PFAS, seller so far doesn't know, he doesn't have any obligation to report, maybe even in New Jersey, what happens then to the seller?
So that's a good question, and one that we will be tackling on Wednesday in our legal liability session. The short answer is that depending on how the deal is transacted, a buyer is not required under Florida law to provide the seller with any of the results of the due diligence. So that would be one strategy to insulate a nervous seller who's concerned about opening up his or her kimono and then being left holding the bag if the buyer goes away and the seller now has his or her report in front of Allison or someone at FDEP. That's the easy answer. A more complicated answer, more complicated scenario is what happens when the seller is given the report. Does the seller have a disclosure obligation, a reporting obligation? Does he or she have actual knowledge? And there are various schools of thought depending on which lawyer you speak to. Some lawyers may say that if a seller hasn't commissioned the underlying report and it has no legal right of reliance, then that information doesn't rise to the level of actual knowledge or actionable knowledge. But it's fuzzy. It's really fuzzy. And that's why it's important for buyers and sellers to structure these types of transactions very carefully and make sure that there are open lines of communication between counsel for buyers and sellers.
Hi there, Natalia Kinete. I'm from FIU. So a little bit different. I'm actually a professor in the Department of Chemistry. So I actually gonna say just bringing some bad news. Sadly, PFAS are also found in indoors. Okay, it's not only outdoors. You can find them in the air. You can find them in the rain. You basically can find them everywhere. So I actually measure those compounds in my lab. So what I was gonna ask is, when you talk about, in this perspective, right, for real estate, is there a specific concentration that, for example, of course, there are some areas that are gonna be more impacted, right? Especially if you're close to some point sources, like you mentioned here, landfills, or airports, or close to military air bases. So the question is, is there a specific concentration from specific PFAS, right? We have thousands of those compounds, right? Is there a specific concentration that is normally advised, that the concentration is above a certain level? Then, for example, the person that should not buy the property, or if they buy the property, there should be some kind of remediation, or if they can claim something, if they experience, for example, some health effects. I think that's what the curiosity is, because you're gonna find them everywhere. So. Sure,
and actually a number of us were at the EPA Brownfields Conference last year, the National Brownfields Conference, where an EPA official cited to a national study that was undertaken that shows that in many instances, rainwater contains concentrations of PFAS that are higher than what was then the health advisory levels set by US EPA and, of course, by many states. I'd love to hear the perspective of some of the other experts in the room, and maybe my colleagues here, but there's a legal answer in terms of what concentrations are actionable depending on which constituent you're measuring, and that answer varies at the state level from state to state to state, and it also varies at the federal level. And of course, the federal number is coming way, 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 way down to 4 parts per trillion, right? Here in Florida, we have a provisional number for PFOA and PFAS, I believe, of 70 parts per trillion. Right, plus the combination of the two. So there's that answer, but then there is the answer that Edwin and Kelly gave, and that is, notwithstanding the number, notwithstanding that Allison or some of her colleagues at FDEP or Miami-Dade County or any other local pollution control agency can initiate enforcement and require a cleanup, there may be reasons to go forward and transact a site and initiate a cleanup and redevelopment if you can get comfortable from Edwin with environmental insurance, and if Kelly can get his investors and or lenders comfortable, and they like the property and the return on investment, then the fact that some cleanup may be required becomes irrelevant. It gets, I'll use a phrase that the kids like to use, it gets baked into the cost. It's just another line item in the project budget and the timeline and the compilation of milestones. And so these projects can go forward, and frequently do, according to this panel, notwithstanding the fact that there may be some very real and serious cleanup that's occurring. So I appreciate your question, because again, it underscores what the message we're trying to get out in the community. The presence of PFAS and all of this uncertainty associated with the regulation, it's not existential. It's not the end of the world. Tools exist that get supplemented by all the great consulting done by the folks here in this room. Does anyone else have a perspective they want to offer to that?
Can I?
Sure.
Yeah, if you're, looking at any of the guidelines, of course, the PFAS at parts per trillion, any site would give you pause where PFAS is detected. But just from a high level, layman like myself, you're looking at, very obvious things. What was the likely source of the contamination? Is the source still ongoing, or is that something that likely stopped a long time ago? Where is the PFAS on the site? If we just have some PFAS in soil that can easily be removed and taken to a hazardous waste facility, not a big issue. If you've got PFAS in your groundwater that's throughout the site and likely leaching onto other sites, that's something to consider regardless of the levels, especially if people are drinking from it. So there's a lot of things that need to be taken into account and looked at holistically, not just I have PFAS on my site and it's this many parts per trillion or billion or in my groundwater. You really need to look at the entire picture to make those type of determinations.
You answered the question like an underwriter. That's basically the similar mindset that I have when I look at PFAS, but the other components is who are we insuring and who's involved, and do they have a legal interest, and to what extent, what's the worst case scenario? Those are things that I'm thinking, not necessarily the levels.
Brent, your FlowServe. Just a quick question. During the introductory presentation, you talked about a definition of brownfield. We missed the definition of PFAS because that's still up for debate depending upon which organization. I assume you're talking about the 6 that have been identified by the EPA, but PFAS could cover, 12,000 different chemicals?
Thousands.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
I saw Frank's hands go up first a little while ago, so let me get Frank, and then we'll come back this way.
Thank you. First of all, I agree with your overall assessment, Michael. I think these sites can move in commerce, they can be safely developed. And what I'm learning about this is I believe that the PFAS issue is to some extent a broadening of what I call the off-site issue. In other words, if I have solvents, if I have arsenic, if I have any number of things, the issue is how will I deal with it off-site? I can usually deal with it on-site through institutional and engineering controls. The PFAS plumes may just be bigger. They may not be bigger because there's a source on my property. They may be bigger because there's a zillion sources all over the place. So that's a first round issue, is dealing with basically a large plume. But we still handle it the same way. Still, it's going to be in Florida institutional and engineering controls. And one additional factor that helps you on brownfields, I think, is the memorandum of understanding with EPA, saying that EPA, if you work through brownfield, they won't come get you on CERCLA. That's going to be very important when PFAS becomes or some of them become listed hazardous substances. So there's another layer that makes it good to go through the brownfields program. I had a question following for Edwin, though, and that is, as Michael identified, the liability limitation in brownfields is for personal injury. So really, if I can plug the hole with personal injury and property damage through insurance, then I have made a great stride forward in the risk for a buyer, and I can offer that risk control to the seller by adding him as an additional insured, likewise a lender. So are the underwriters seeing really much risk? And I've always wondered how underwriters analyze this, but what's the real risk of personal injury litigation on a given site in the sticks somewhere? I realize there's class action things, and I'd like to hear what you say about that too. How do underwriters analyze the risk for personal injury in PFAS sites?
Absolutely. Like what's around the site is kind of what we're looking at. Is it going into a residential area where there is drinking water? Is it going into a natural resource? I mean, the surrounding area is a big factor on how comfortable we can get with third-party BIPD. Obviously, if it's in a brownfield site and it's the purchaser, kind of we like to say that in New York City brownfield, they call it the volunteer or the innocent insured. That helps a lot, and that's the only insured under our policy. Now, if you're bringing in the responsible party as additional name insured, and the game's out, and it's a different game. The game is what's around it, and how likely am I how likely are they to be sued, and how much will I be spending in that defense?
I think that's useful for people to analyze in their thoughts about these sites. But Michael, I agree with you. I think these can be done, and they're going to be done. There's no doubt in my mind.
Frank, thank you. And you made a very good point about the connection between the Brownfields program and the memorandum of agreement with Superfund that limits their ability to initiate enforcement when a site is being cleaned up under a brownfield site rehabilitation agreement. That doesn't prevent cost recovery claims or contribution claims under CERCLA, but it takes EPA off the board because they have a lot of confidence in FDEP and the state's local pollution control programs.
Hi.
And Robin has a question.
Let's see, I'll put this under case study, I think. I'll get to my question. Hopefully it's not too rambling. From the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, East Metro, early 2000s, 3M was on the radar for impacting East Metro wells, including ones where I live. And they settled in 2018 for $850 million with the state. So when I look at those claims numbers, that was the first thing that kind of caught my eye was, okay, $6 million was the big one. This was based on 3 landfills, pre-Clean Water Act landfills, about $275 million per site, say-ish. So that was just one thing that popped in my head in terms of, hey, how do I feel about some of these claim numbers that are being thrown out? Granted, that affected 7 municipalities and, 250,000 people. So you're in a highly metropolitan area that, as you were just mentioning, that probably plays a role. But then the Senate, another anecdote on this is the state Minnesota Pollution Control Agency just finished, not just, about a year ago, finished sampling 107 of their landfills in the closed landfill program. and found PFAS detections in 97 of them and exceeding groundwater standards in 40 of them. So they're the ones that currently own the environmental liability on that. And I guess if I bring it all the way back to your question of, okay, hey, existing framework, do we work under existing framework, or do we need to use a new framework? And I kind of hold that thought around the ubiquitousness that we keep talking about of this compound, and we say, well, wow, I mean, 50 closed landfills in the state exceeding groundwater standards. We already saw 3M do what it's going to do. Which is more advantageous to a client? Is it more advantageous for them to wait to see where the dust settles because, wow, it's everywhere kind of thing? Or is it more advantageous to move forward under existing frameworks?
So I'll throw out an answer, and I'm going to channel what Kelly would likely say, and that's this. Fortune favors the bold, right? Where there's so much uncertainty, the marketplace is likely to reflect that in a very significant purchase price discount. And for those who have a high level of risk tolerance and are fairly sophisticated in the way they approach underwriting, they are likely to move forward sooner than later and not wait for the dust to settle. So some of these sites are going to transact sooner than later, and then maybe more come back into the stream of commerce as the CERCLA exemptions are worked out through Congress or EPA settles on a final safe harbor from an administrative discretion perspective. Kelly, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and again, like any contaminants, just from a 100,000 foot point of view, if the EPA or state regulatory body is going to punish either property owners or the actual contaminators from PFAS to a level that's not financially viable. 3M can handle $850 million. Kite cannot handle $850 million. He's going to declare bankruptcy, and the site's going to sit there. So, we're under the belief that the regulations will get tailored to something that makes sense. If you're going to, bankrupt people or make them insolvent because the punishments are so high, I highly doubt, the federal state governments are just going to come in and clean everything up on their dime or the taxpayers' dimes. So it has to be engineered in a way that makes sense, like our environmental regulations have been evolving, and that's kind of the gear that we move under. As a bona fide third-party purchaser, a volunteer, as Edwin said, you have to look at yourself, from that perspective versus are you the one that caused the contamination? Did you know you were causing the contamination? So, those are factors that play an important role, but as an innocent third party and someone who is voluntarily coming in to try to correct the situation, I think we'll see that the regulators will look very favorably on that in the long term.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. My company manufactures construction materials that are applied in environmental cleanup types of work. We've talked a lot about the liabilities between the owners and sellers of property. I work with consulting engineers like this guy to my right here, and we come up with plans to remediate sites, and then we enact the construction to do that work. I have a lot of experience in underground storage tanks. It's an entirely different industry, but the ramifications of environmental impact are equal, really almost in some ways, to what we're talking about here. And what we've discovered, really, this comes from the US EPA out of Washington, is that a lot of the conceptual site models that were used to make determinations on how we were going to clean up leaking underground storage tanks really, frankly, failed. And so now the big question is who's on the hook after we had gotten sign-off from a local jurisdiction, a state EPA that said that site was cleaned up, it was good to go. Who's going to assume that responsibility now that those sites are still releasing contaminants and are still a problem to soils and groundwater? So my question to the panel is this: what protections or what risks or what liabilities do material manufacturers, consulting engineers, and the contractor industry out there, what do we face when we get involved in the cleanup of these sites? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question. It's beyond the scope of this panel. I would say an easy answer is consult your attorney. A second answer that may be more satisfying is bring that question up again on Wednesday. It's a good one for the legal panel to struggle with.
Oh, I'm not going to answer that question. That was a good question, though. Michael and panel and Edwin and I agree with your premise that these sites are transactable, but my question is kind of more in the details to Edwin. So I represent a buyer. We purchase an environmental insurance policy. I'm in the brownfield programs. I'm redeveloping the site. What exclusions are there on the policy to sample for PFAS voluntarily, because I'm developing a large industrial warehouse that has 2 very large linear stormwater ponds, and I'm adjacent to either a municipal airport with known former military base contamination, or I'm part of a former military base that we're, a private party is redeveloping. So I've had experience with environmental insurance policies where there's exclusions for voluntarily notifying the regulatory agency. But in situations like this, we have to sample the groundwater for PFAS to determine how to manage it as far as construction activities related to the redevelopment. So that was a convoluted question, but I think you know where I'm going.
Yeah, I face it every day. It's technically you don't have a PFAS exclusion. Sorry. Technically you don't have a PFAS exclusion. You don't have a voluntary investigation exclusion. So you're allowed to. There's nothing in the policy that would prevent you from doing that. And that's kind of the issue, right? So we wrote these policies for 10-year periods, and we're out there, and they're sitting out there, and so that's within your right to do. Now there are situations, and that's the trick with brownfields, is that you're buying this policy, you're opening up the ground. I mean, that's the deal. You know going in that's going to happen, and so it's a tougher underwrite. Many of our competitors don't want to write brownfields because of that. We're one of the few that still do, and so now there's the situations as in you're an industrial property, you're continuing to be industrial, and then you have, a voluntary investigation exclusion, capital improvement exclusion.
Well, that's what I'm referring to as the voluntary investigation or the capital exclusion.
Yeah, well,
capital improvement exclusion.
That's a situation where you can't sample. The government basically needs to knock on your door to, now what you can do is renegotiate that program. Maybe go to your underwriter, the carrier, and say, hey, this is my situation, what can we do to get comfortable with this? It doesn't mean you can't do technically a cancel rewrite and say, under what circumstances can you help me here? Can you do a higher deductible? Can you do a sublimit? That's an approach.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that you are, as the underwriter, writing policies where you will not include the voluntary investigation exclusion and will not include a capital improvement
Yeah, if you're
exclusion.
telling me those exclusions are worthless if it's a brownfield redevelopment. Right?
Correct. No, I mean generally, because that's the premise of the panel, right? That the value is the fact that it's in a brownfield program, and for the brownfield to be successful, it has to be redeveloped, or it doesn't work.
Correct.
Right. So we have that. So I think that's an important thing for everybody to be aware of. And, don't be caught up in the traps, because you have to do the sampling.
Yeah, you should, a brownfield policy for the most part should just have a specified contamination exclusion that excludes a contamination that you're likely to find or that it's there. It shouldn't have a voluntary investigation or capital improvement, because that kind of defeats the purpose. You're going to break ground. That's the point. That's the point of it.
Before we move on to the next question, just to piggyback on Robin's great question and Edwin's comprehensive and very helpful response, a pro tip for those who are not necessarily comfortable advising their clients on environmental insurance, but are now coming away with this information, this resource. And environmental insurance is infrequently procured directly from an underwriter. there will be an intermediary. There will be an environmental insurance agent that reaches out not only to Edwin, but some of Edwin's colleagues in the industry, other underwriters. Not all underwriters will be as willing to provide coverage as underwriters who are actively engaged in the brownfield space. And if your insurance agent or your client's insurance agent is not that sophisticated, they may not reach out to the right 2 or 3 underwriters to procure a quote. And so in the real world, when you go back to wherever it is that we traveled from, and you're working with your clients on getting coverage, if they've reached out to insurance companies that aren't in the environmental space, you're not going to get the coverage that you're hearing about today. Keep that in mind. And one easy way to address that is going forward to make sure that your agent solicits a quote from at least Beazley, among others. We have no financial interest. I don't have any stock in the company, but we've worked with them long enough to know that they provide very meaningful solutions where others don't.
We've got a question here, and then I'm going to ask if any of our virtual attendees, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll come back to you. We've got 2 questions lined up here.
So actually, I had the same question you did, but a little bit different. Are there any scenarios where, I mean, not necessarily with brownfields, but just underwriting policy where you don't want to see any sampling, or you actually won't even, if you, like for instance, that site in New Jersey, they're almost going to get RAO, but you know PFAS has to be investigated, and they haven't sampled for it yet. Would you say we're not going to write a policy till we get the actual preliminary data, or are you willing to say we'll underwrite a policy before we even get that data?
It's not my job to tell a client to sample or not sample. I can just give them feedback on what's there. And part of underwriting PFAS is looking at the history of the site and saying, how likely is it to have PFAS, and to what levels? And if there is, where is it going, and who's going to be impacted?
Right.
And who am I insuring?
Right. But I mean, the idea that maybe, because sometimes I've seen, people kind of bypass sampling because they're like, we'll just put an environmental insurance policy on it. And then you're like, well, maybe you should sample and have an idea, like maybe it's there, but it's contained, or, and I'm always kind of curious, and, sometimes underwriters just don't seem as worried about even getting that data, or you would think they'd want it, but I don't know, sometimes, I mean, even attorneys will say, no, we don't want to know, don't sample. So I'm just curious, like when.
Well, it's part of like, it depends on the knowledge of the underwriter. If they've been doing it for a long time and they can suspect based on the industries what's there, you don't really need to sample. I mean, if it's been 30 years of plating operations, you know what's going to be there. So,
right.
You kind of use that judgment.
Okay. So you don't care if it's really bad? You're just like, oh, I'm assuming it's there.
I'll make that decision based on the overall circumstances and whether I need and don't need it.
Before Michael Spivak, you go, I just want to make one point regarding that question about whether or not to sample, and what you hear from other professionals involved in a matter, whether it's a consultant or a lawyer. Make sure to stay for the session, the last session on Wednesday, because you're going to hear a full spectrum of opinions, very strong opinions from the lawyers who are dealing with these sites all over the state as to whether or not to sample. There are some who are clearly in the school of sample, regardless. If you if you think you see a shadow of a hint of an echo of something, sample. And you're going to also hear a strong opinion to the exact contrary. If you don't have a documented release or an actual source, then absolutely do not sample. And each opinion will be backed up by legal analysis and professional lived experience.
Thank you, Michael. I think, Kelly, you might be best for this question. So as a buyer of a property, during due diligence, we're able to do a lot of sampling on the site, almost as much as we want, but we can only go as far as the property boundary. How do you quantify your off-site risk? Because something like PFAS has potential for a much higher off-site risk that could be harder to quantify.
Well, again, once we have that sampling back, once we have a phase 1 and phase 2, I'd say you have to take everything into account holistically, like just like Edwin's mentioning here. What were the likely sources of that? Is there something off-site that was the reason for the PFAS on your site? Is it in groundwater? If it's in groundwater, sure, it's probably likely to migrate much faster than if you just have it, in the top 2 feet of soil. So, that's a risk you're going to have to deal with. A lot of your neighbors are not going to allow you to test on their site and to see what's there. It's, for me anyway, it's taking all those factors into account. Historical use of the property, where the PFAS likely came from, is it concentrated, in a certain area of the site? Is it throughout the site? And then what those adjacent uses are. I mean, are you impacting a nursery school? Are you impacting, an industrial warehouse? And time of exposure, if it's a residential area where, kids are playing on the lawn every day, you've got some big issues there, even at limited exposure. If it's railroad tracks next to you, probably not going to have, too much of an issue.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions from our virtual, Dave? Any hands up at this point? Okay. More audience questions? All right.
Bill, you've been lapped.
Yeah.
You'll be next.
I'm sorry, Bill. You can have it. Let him go. Let him go. Let him go.
Bill can go first.
No, let him go. Let Bill go.
My question has to do with the brownfield program. You guys mentioned that you're using it pretty regularly to deal with these types of sites and use it as a tool in your tool belt to help understand and get through your underwriting and everything like that. Looking at the state program that we have here and how it refunds VICTIC credits as a way to incentivize you, do you think there's going to be a run on the program if we decide that PFAS sites are going to be redeveloped and you're going to use the brownfield program? We're already, I won't say we have problems paying those off. We have a backlog, and that backlog typically gets wiped out and we start all over again. Do you see that process accelerating, how that program may not be as viable in the future?
That's a great question. For those who don't know, historically, when the Florida Voluntary Cleanup Tax Credit Program was created, the funding allocation statewide was $2 million. And you couldn't give away a brownfield site to get anyone to get into the program. This was 1998. Shortly thereafter, the program began to become popular and more heavily utilized, and the funding on a statewide basis increased from $2 million to $5 million. That amount quickly proved to be insufficient, and so the legislature for years increased the annual allocation to $10 million. And that proved to be insufficient because now the popularity of the program is just screaming red hot, and the demand for tax credits is increasing almost exponentially. So this year, miracle of miracles, the legislature increased the annual allocation from $10 million to $35 million. On an annual basis, that's permanent, that's forever and ever. Forever and ever, forever and ever, so we hope. The governor has not signed it, but my understanding is that he would have to veto the entire budget in order to take that funding allocation out of play. We don't think that's going to happen. So you have $35 million a year for brownfield projects statewide, year in and year out. And that's going to be good for the next 5 or 10 years. Those of us who observe this program closely think the annual demand on tax credits is somewhere between $18 and $19 million. Will the and we won't have to expand the program, the brownfields program, to accept PFAS sites because they're already eligible, right? But will more sites impacted by this emergent contaminant have an increased demand, place an increased demand on a limited amount of tax credits? Absolutely. But that's inevitable. That's going to happen irrespective of the contaminant because, again, the program is very successful And my take on it is that the demand, my observation, looking at the numbers year after year after year, is that the increase in tax credit demand is about 7 to 8% year after year. And that's going to happen irrespective of the contaminant of concern, but because we're running out of clean sites to build on. It's a natural function of the amount of people moving into Florida and the voracious appetites of developers for new, usable residential, industrial, and commercial land.
So you agree that it's going to be used more often?
Absolutely. But not exclusively, Bill, because it's going to be used more often for more gas stations and more dry cleaners and more ag sites. Frank?
Yeah, I think we want it to be used more often. Before you get too far from that, if you're not a member of the Florida Brownfields Association, what are you thinking? Because they're the people who, in part, to a large extent, got that $35 million to pass in the legislative session. And it was not, I didn't do the work. Michael worked on it, Michael Schnapseiler, Joe Ulo, and others. And then FBA funded a lobbying group that cost a lot of money. So if you're not shipping into the Florida Brownfields Association and a member and active in it, you should be. This is important. I wanted to go back to something he said, though, about the people working on the site, which I don't think we touched on. And that is because of worker health and safety and including construction people on the site. And all of these sites, whether PFAS or not, should have a site environmental management plan. But I'd really like to hear from the health and safety folks and the consulting people, how does that plan vary given PFAS and its risk? And including, you know, the idea that it's probably in every sample you're taking, but also in the earth and the water. So let's not lose sight of that health and safety for the worker aspect, which is a liability for the companies too. Thanks.
So, Michael and probably Kelly, this question is for you guys. You know, with the premise that the Florida Brownfield Program or a Brownfield Program will help facilitate being able to buy and sell these properties. In Florida, walk me through what the BSRA, what the Brownfield Site Rehabilitation Agreement, what you would be committing to with DEP for taking on the redevelopment of the site. So you're cleaning up the PFAS and you're delineating PFAS just on the property? I mean, walk me through the practicality of that.
Well, that's a good question, and there's no easy answer because there are so many fact-specific scenarios, right? Number one, who is the responsible party? Is the responsible party a local government that currently has some protection from liability under the legislation 2 years ago that defers enforcement until the legislature promulgates final standards? If you're a private sector entity, are you buying from a public entity that has a temporary exemption from enforcement? Or are you buying from a source that doesn't, that is already in the private sector and doesn't have that exemption from public liability?
The last situation.
Okay. I think, and I don't know if anyone else is a regulator in this room other than Allison. I hate to impose on you to speak for Hillsborough County EPC, but my guess is that the end point currently from a DEP perspective and through DEP from a local pollution control perspective is the provisional standard of 70 PPT. That's what you would be delineating to. And that's ultimately, in the short term, if you're able to get to the finish line to an SRCO or a CSRCO before final standards are promulgated, then that's the goal line. I think that's what DEP would require.
But do you think that is doable? Like, do you know, our FIU professor, it's everywhere, right? So do you think that these sites, we can delineate even to 70 PPT and all the surrounding? And am I going to be, delineating for all of Orange County?
That's a great abstract for PFAS Forum 4. Right? And I say that only half jokingly. There are a number of great consultants in the audience who could speak to whether it's possible to define a PFAS signature from a particular release and distinguish it from ubiquitous background PFAS contamination. I think that's what the agency would want you to do. Now, I'm gonna argue against myself. DEP may have their hands tied because they may say, well, we have a provisional standard that we know is going to change, so we can't tell you where the goal line is. We can't offer an SRCO until we have formal standards. We'll give you what's called a site status letter, which is you don't have to do anything more, but once final standards are promulgated, you're back in the soup. But notwithstanding that, I believe that it's still possible and one would be legally entitled to enter into a brownfield site rehabilitation agreement, even with the endpoint so in question. Why would one want to do that? One would want to do that to trigger the liability protection, because that, for those who don't know, the liability protection under the Brownfields program becomes effective the moment you sign the agreement with DEP. You don't have to wait until the cleanup is finished. So you get your liability protection on day one, and as you go forward and hire all the good consultants in the room and start paying consulting fees and lawyer fees, you can take down tax credits. That's why you would want to go forward even if the end line, the finish line is blurry because of this uncertainty with respect to what the final promulgated standards would be for any or all of the PFAS compounds within the family.
And from a developer's perspective as well, we know that these regulations are going to be promulgated eventually, and we know current steps to reduce or stabilize PFAS. So if you're in a situation where you're out there doing active remediation and you have equipment and you have people on site doing that, and you know that there's very low-hanging fruit as far as removal or stabilization, it makes a lot of sense to just go ahead and start getting in front of that. Because if you're reducing or stabilizing and preventing that PFAS from migrating, you know you're going to have to do that anyway. To what extent remains to be seen. But that way you're not starting at square one when those regulations do ultimately get issued.
All right, my name is Jesse Higginbotham. Just to provide another regulatory standpoint, I work for Kansas Department of Health and Environment, Bureau of Waste Management. I work in the hazardous permits section, so I deal with facilities under subtitle C of RCRA. And one of the things here is that PFAS, it sounds like, is going to be ubiquitous in the environment. So one of the things that we'd have to evaluate is, okay, how much do we see coming from up gradient in the groundwater or in the soil? So if you see a zone, like they were saying, source elimination, if you see a hot spot that you can eliminate, and as a source, we may not be able to delineate a, quote, where's the end of your plume versus everybody else if you are in the middle of, my example would be downtown Kansas City Metro, and you're next to an oil refinery, a petrochemical plant, a pesticide plant, and 5 railroads. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to delineate, but if we can eliminate and identify a source on your site and remove that source, that's going to make it a lot easier to say, okay, are we at background? Are we getting close to at least where we can't say who did it, but now we can at least get to a point where we can reduce the risk as much as possible.
Thank you. And I can't help myself. You're not in Kansas anymore. But that's a good perspective in and of itself, and just a larger point. The reach of this forum is growing, and it's a testament to Gene that has created this platform where people can struggle with these issues, not just as they relate to Florida, but all over the country. So we're glad you're here. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I guess it's a question and more kind of a comment too. It's interesting from an insurance and developer, and I guess anybody else in the room, but I feel like right now where we're at with PFAS is that the hype is way out in front of the risk, potentially. And the reason for that is, if this was 20, 30, 40 years ago, when if you had a contaminated property, it was all about, remediation and cleanup to pristine. Whereas, over the years, we've shifted to more risk assessment and risk evaluation. So it seems like owning a property that might be contaminated with PFAS, like groundwater impacted with PFAS, as long as it's not the source property, it seems like there's actually less risk than, say, with maybe chlorinated solvents or whatnot, because you don't necessarily have that vapor intrusion concern. If there's not a well nearby or surface water that's the groundwater is discharging to, it just seems like this is going to be a more manageable issue than what you're kind of led to believe at this point.
That's a great comment, and because this is a workshop, I really want to workshop it. For those, I'm gonna put Michael Spivak on the in the spotlight here. What do you think? And then I'd like to hear from some other consultants. What is the technical risk of PFAS compared to chlorinated solvents? Would you be more conservative or less conservative with respect to that statement?
For PFAS, I'd probably be more conservative, only because we just don't understand it yet. Chlorinated solvents, they're well understood. We've been assessing them for years. PFAS, we just don't know. But I was about to raise my hand because I do have a perspective on this, and we're all talking about how low the cleanup target level is going to be for PFAS, but don't forget about dieldrin at 2 parts per trillion, and we're managing. It's a very different compound, obviously, but we also have benzoate pyrene. I mean, it's ubiquitous in the environment. I probably have it on the bottom of my shoe. So, but we're making it work because we understand it. So we do need to be conservative up front, but as we learn, we're going to be able to adapt and figure out what we need to do. Dieldrin is not easy to clean up, especially at 2 parts per trillion, but we're trying it right now. So we got to be conservative up front simply because we just don't know.
Thank you, Michael. Any other technical perspectives that a consultant would like to share? And it's a great benchmark, and I'm glad you brought it up because chlorinated solvents is, that's the Frankenstein in the room, right? Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, chlorinated solvents. Everyone gets very concerned about chlorinated solvents. Where is this PFAS risk along that spectrum from a technical perspective? Who else can speak to that, is willing to speak to that? In the back, sir.
Hang on 1 sec. Hang on. I'm going to get this on.
I mean, there's a solubility issue between the two, too, because the chlorinated solvents are not going to be nearly as water soluble as a lot of the PFAS compounds are going to be. And so how they're moving and how they're moving through the environment is going to be a completely different risk. And the way that the chlorinated solvents were distributed throughout the environment is also different than what we were seeing with the AAAF foam, for example, and other sites and specifics, or brownfields, or not just brownfields, but biosolids now, right? I mean, biosolids are going to be a huge issue in agriculture.
Which is one of the reasons why it's one of those 5 sectors being addressed by Senator Lumen's legislation. And I want to offer a corollary to my initial working thesis, and that is we're not blasé about the risk associated with PFAS. Even though we think it's manageable and that transactions can occur, we're very respectful of the technical uncertainty, the evolving regulations, and the very significant cost that goes into consulting, lawyering, assessing, and remediating. That's not something that can be dismissed easily with pretty words. But the consensus that's emerging here, and not just up here, but among the sharks, which is you all, is that these sites can be transacted and redeveloped and reused.
I raised my hand because I wanted to play Shark Tank, but then you asked that question about whether or not anyone knew whether you could delineate plumes with any distinction. And I am not a chemist. However, I could swear I remember from last year, there was a researcher who did a presentation who, one of the benefits of PFAS and PFOA containing so many different types of chemical compounds, he was doing mass spectrometry to be able to delineate this plume over here has a higher percentage of this type of compound and and he was in the beginning stages of being able to do that. So I'm eager to find out this year if there's any presentation follow-up on that. But if I could be a shark for a moment, I would be super excited about your presentation and ready to buy in on the condition if you were planning to do industrial commercial use. I would be afraid to invest if you were planning for residential at this stage, simply because I'm not as risky as an investor, evidently, as you guys are willing to be. But this whole concept of right now, the statement being any level of exposure has some sort of health detriment, and if you test it, it's going to be there. So where are you really going to get clean soil down to 0 that's below 4 ppt to be able to reach, residential levels where babies can crawl around in the sand and put it in their mouth in the backyard?
That is a great shark comment and validates this whole workshop. Thank you for that input. And it's well taken, because, Kelly, correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of your risk underwriting for this particular contaminant, you're really focused on industrial reuse or non-residential reuses.
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't seen a site that is PFAS impacted where we've even considered, residential use yet.
Yes. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let's try that. I was in a presentation, this woman was just mentioning a process around fingerprinting of PFAS, and they were looking at I think what it was called was a total oxidizable precursor. So where they crunch all those into one and you can get a signature. So that's one thing that's kind of interesting and happening on commingled plumes with PFAS. And one other aspect of technical risk, and my information might be a little dated because this was a brownfields conference maybe in 2017, but toxicologists who'd been studying, a lot of the PFAS associated with this 3M plume was what was happening with the continually changing standard is that the statistics on the toxicology was not converging, and so they had to keep going to the lowest number that was available. So that's now whether that could continue to be the case, and it's going to continue dropping. If we want to talk about that as a technical risk, I suppose, but. That was what I recall. I'm not a toxicologist, but that was what they had found after, that would have been 17 years of research on the compound.
So as a construction manufacturer, I can I've got a scientific perspective on PFAS as it relates to making our materials that go out on site to contain and clean up PFAS-affected sites. And we are having to test our material now, this gentleman can attest to that, to verify and confirm that our materials themselves don't contain PFAS and introduce PFAS at a site. And I'm in agreement with that gentleman from Kansas City, and I'm glad he's here because the reality of it is, in my opinion, seeing what I've seen and really, I think, understanding the breadth and the scale of this issue. And remember, really, aside from a few states, there are very few standards. Obviously, EPA is looking at, the new rule now, but I think what it's going to come down to is we're going to figure out that there are very, very few places, a limited number of places, that are going to be willing to take PFAS-affected soils and other material and dispose of that, or correct it or clean it up. And what we're going to end up with is a lot of capping in place where exactly we identify the source, we eliminate the source, and we try to do our very best to contain what's already there. On a project this gentleman and I have worked on, Brian Massa with Horsley Witten, one of the sponsors here, we couldn't find a place reasonable within 4 states of Massachusetts to dispose of contaminated soil. We had no choice but to take the design approach we did. We have a poster, it's number 10. It's out there, to see, but this is what it came down to. And again, you've got to go back, identify the source, and then try to control the situation as best you can. Thank you.
You bring up a great point there about bringing in equipment or material in order to remove the PFAS that actually has PFAS in it. One thing you certainly want to make sure of is that your consultant is using a lab that can deal with PFAS, that's certified to deal with PFAS, because what you have is certain labs that aren't familiar with it, that aren't qualified to do that, are using materials within the lab that also contain PFAS and hence contaminate the samples, or treating them in a way that, we can't guarantee they haven't come into contact with other PFAS. So, great point.
I want to come back to that issue that you all raised about the site boundaries. So I'm curious, in your experiences in like the $6 million New Jersey one that you had, Edwin, did you get to a point where you could argue, hey, yeah, there's PFAS, but it's part of the ubiquitous PFAS from other facilities? Or did they obligate you to keep going and going?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I know for sure it didn't go off sites. In that case specifically, it was on site. But we tried obviously very hard to negotiate, and that's actually a good point. It varies by state greatly. So some states they won't negotiate. Jersey will not negotiate, at least in that situation. And other situations where we're hearing out to the point where we have kind of New Jersey on our hot list of whenever we have a site PFAS there. And then there are other states that are a lot more flexible, North Carolina, South Carolina, where, hey, some of them have made the comment where, chlorinated solvents are worse. We rather, deal with it in a similar manner.
I just wanted to jump back to the couple comments about the environmental forensics, and I'm going to be doing a presentation actually on environmental forensics tomorrow for PFAS. So it actually is completely possible, and it is helpful for when you have these commingled plumes when they leave the property and you're not sure whose is whose. And knowing your source is a great way to actually determine whose PFAS it is to help you with that.
Obviously we all know commingled plumes are nothing new, right? So you have CVOCs also commingled, and good luck trying to find who's who in those scenarios. So it's part of our life, right?
I think we are on the countdown, right? We have 15 more minutes in this workshop. It's been a good 2 hours. Do we have any more questions?
I guess just you talked about how like vapor intrusion, I guess, the common belief is it was an issue, but then I think some of the evolving science is saying with the fluorotelomers, the shorter chain stuff, it might be. So from your perspective, like how are you guys staying on top of things that are, it's constantly evolving, and all of a sudden, geez, maybe it is a vapor issue for, fluorotelomers. Like how are you educating yourself? Or you're just waiting till you get burnt by something and be like, all right, I guess we learned our lesson, like with Jersey, or you kind of, are you reading all the scientific papers out there? Like, are you leading our consultants? Like, how do you guys?
From an underwriting perspective, obviously.
Oh, all of you, yeah.
Just I guess I answer it first. From an underwriting perspective, we're definitely on top of it. Like I said, every submission account that comes on my desk, I'm thinking PFAS is the first thing I'm thinking about. We also have outside resources as far as environmental consultants, legal, trying to help us make those decisions, which are not easy.
On our end, we go to conferences like this one, where we have the best-in-class consultants teach us on the technical side. We follow very closely what's happening in Congress, at the agency level, and in Tallahassee with the Florida legislature and the FDOT. We have to stay on top so we can advise our clients, and if we're also doing deals, make good informed business decisions.
Yeah, and as a simple layman here, for those of you who aren't environmental consultants or attorneys or engineers, what have you, I ask all of our consultants to keep us updated. When they see news pieces coming across the table that I might not be aware of, keep us in the loop. At every meeting that I have, even if it's not related to PFAS, I ask, what have you heard, what have you seen? Because the stuff's coming at us quick and it's changing by the day.
You mentioned the shorter chain compounds, and Michael, you might recall this project where we had a certain government agency and the representative who was very concerned about vapor intrusion associated with PFAS and insisted it would be an issue. And I just wanted to make this comment that our client, just to hedge their bets and get their grant, just decided to put a vapor barrier down. You know, the science wasn't there. We couldn't actually collect samples at the time, so they hedged their bets and they moved forward with the project.
Question back there.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you're thinking about all the different regulators, and they seem to be all evolving at the same time. You know, the different states are evolving and the feds are evolving and they have different standards and they keep coming up with, it seems like, new numbers every week. And so it's like, how do you find the courage to move forward, as you said, with a liability once you sign that in? But, you know, the National Drinking Water Standard just came out and completely subsumed all the state limits for that. And it's how do you, the question was, how do you find that information and how do you deal with that kind of information as the regulators keep evolving? And how do you balance between kind of the federal and state regulations?
So from my perspective, that's where we started. There are a number of tools that we've talked about in depth that can get a buyer and or a lender comfortable. And if the upside is significant enough, if you buy right, most deals are done most profits are made in the real estate world on the buy side, and the financial analysis works out. You have best-in-class consulting, you have smart environmental lawyers like Frank and Robin, and you have a great partner in the environmental underwriting community like Beazley, like Edwin, then if you like the property, you're going to move forward more often than not. Notwithstanding the fact that tracking the standards is a little like playing whack-a-mole, right? Each state has its own approach. The numbers go up, the numbers go down, and now we have EPA coming in with a very, very low number. But there remains a tremendous amount of opportunity in the environmental redevelopment space. I think this is a good place to land the plane. And for those who are willing to accept a higher level of risk, the tools exist to box that risk in an acceptable manner and unlock the intrinsic value of the real estate.
Michael, if I can make a quick comment.
Sure.
And not to take up bar time, but Kelly, was a comment that you made about getting informed about what's going on in the community, get articles or whatever. I would encourage everybody to join the LinkedIn group for the forum itself. And it's a way for everybody, if you see an article, post it. Keep everybody posted of what's going on. If we see new standards from various states of what they're doing, I would encourage people to post lawsuits that are going on that come up. It's just a way to keep the group engaged. You know, we do the forum once a year, but a lot goes on in between forums. So definitely keep everybody involved that way.
Gene, thank you. A lot of the information that I share through Gene's platform, many platforms, including a lot of the information that went into my slides, comes from a federal service called InsideEPA.com. They're doing, I think, the best job in the country in tracking federal developments in the U.S. Congress and at the administrative level. Anything else? Well, thank you all for coming. This was a great workshop. Appreciate it. And thank you to my panelists.
Thank you, panel. And we are going to be in the exhibit hall is where the reception is going to be taking place.
You don't want to hold on to those notes I learned.